Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Shelley Burr. Shelley is the author of the international bestseller Wake. She works at the Department of Agriculture, Water, and the Environment in Canberra, Australia. She grew up splitting her time between Newcastle and Glenrowan. Welcome, Shelley.
Thank you. It's so awesome to be here.
It's so fun. I love the accent. It's fun to be down under where everything's getting warmer and brighter as things are getting colder and grayer here. I loved Murder Town. So before we get into I want to talk about the main characters and all the juicy stuff. But first, why don't you tell our listeners about Murder Town?
Yeah, certainly. So Murder Town is my second novel, and it's the story of a town where it used to be a fairly bustling tourist town. It's the sort of place that people would stop on road trips to get a cup of coffee, a cake, stretch their legs. Just a beautiful little place. And then a series of really awful murders took place there. And since then, the town has just become inextricably associated with those murders. If anybody says the name of the town, immediately what pops into their head is those images of the horrible things that happened there. In the years since, the town has gone into a real economic decline. It's been bypassed. There's not as many jobs. The businesses are really struggling. And so the people of the town are presented with this very dark idea of they will start running a walking tour through the sites of the murders, and that will attract people back to town. They'll start going to the businesses and things will pick up again. At the same time, the people that were killed are the friends and family of the people in town. And so they're trading on that memory. And it's like, do we really want to even more closely tie ourselves into this dark history? You know, even if the alternative is potentially letting the town collapse entirely and disappear. The main character is Gemma, who was working in her family's tea shop on the night of the final murder and actually failed to let someone in that she thought might be a threat to her safety, but unfortunately turned out to be the final victim. And so since then, she's lived with this idea of, if I'd opened the door in time, would that person have survived?
And they're gonna have a town meeting at the tea, in the tea shop to talk about whether or not this tour should happen, and then somebody's dead. So that's how the whole thing launches, and the rest of it is a fun sort of cat and mouse game with a lot of different pieces. It's, there's nothing sort of straightforward. It all fits together, but it's fun because it's not what you expect. It wasn't what I expected. So I really enjoyed. We had a character who was in prison, was a private investigator and in prison for doing something, I mean, not good, but arguably not as bad as some things. And he comes into the play. I enjoyed everything about that. Gemma is interesting because Gemma, it's hard. It was just kind of maybe hard to describe her position in a short interview, but she was involved with somebody else before she became involved with the man who is the father of her child. And so she has all these sort of, and I guess because it's a small town, right? You think about these small towns and everybody knows everybody. Everybody's known each other since they were kids. And so everybody has, perspectives about who people were and what they're capable of, which may or may not be realistic, right? Not everything if we bring from childhood is who we become as adults. So it's really fun to see. And her perspective, I think, is, she's somebody who potentially gave up a lot, which I think, women do, right? To raise her child the best she could, and ended up coming back to this small town to raise Violet. And that is interesting too. So tell me how your ideas happen. This is your second book. It sounds like your first book was, a really big book. I haven't read it yet. But how did the stories emerge for you? Because this is a complicated story. This is not like this thing happens and then, there's an ending.
Yeah, so there's really two phases for me of, particularly with Murder Town, of coming up with the idea of, I remember when I first came up with the idea that I wanted to explore this particular situation that the town was in because I was reading a news article about a town here in Australia called Snowtown. And it's a little bit more challenging doing the international interviews because in an Australian interview or at an Australian festival, I just say that word and everybody gasps.
Oh, uh-huh.
Oh, yeah, Snowtown. We all know what you mean by that. Whereas international audiences, it doesn't
Not
have that
yet.
immediacy
No.
of the imagery. And so there was a series of awful murders that happened in real life in Snowtown, and they are not the inspiration for the murders that happen in the book Murder Town, but it's a very similar situation of that, they were called the Snowtown murders, and so everybody immediately thinks of them when you mention the town. And
Right.
so I was reading an article about the people who still live in Snowtown and love it there, and just the situation that they're facing of, do we lean into this history or do we try and step away from it, change the name of the town? And in that article, it mentioned that they actually have people that come to town to take selfies in front of the location. The bodies were found in a bank vault stored in barrels. And so
Yeah.
people come into town to take photos of themselves in front of the Snowtown Bank because it's associated with those murders. And so the moment I read that, it was just like this click of, oh, I've got to learn more about that, and I have to explore that a little bit. And so whenever I'm trying to come up with an idea for a story, I'm always looking for people in an interesting situation that that I'm not sure what I would do if I was put in that situation. And so
Right.
that's where there's space to explore it a bit more. And then, so I knew I wanted to write this story about this town. And from then I needed characters to populate it. And Gemma, very early on, I understood that I wanted to explore that idea of not opening the door to someone because you understand the situation that she's in. There's been this series of murders in town. Everybody's on high alert. Everybody's installed new deadbolts. Her mother gives her an Anne Rule book about Ted Bundy and how to avoid killed by a serial killer. And so she does all the right things. And she doesn't open the door and she doesn't let herself be a victim. And somebody else dies as a result. And so she's been living with that. And, there's other consequences from that decision. It really changes the course of her life. And it's interesting that you mentioned earlier about like growing up in a small town and everybody knowing you since you're a kid and trying to grow past that. She's in a really interesting situation that she simultaneously grew up really, really fast and became an adult much sooner than most people did. She's running a business. She has a child. She's, trying to keep everybody around her together and afloat. But also at the same time, she's a little bit frozen in that place that she was as a 19-year-old and, hasn't necessarily developed the way that she might have if she'd gone out into the world and lived a different life.
Yeah, I mean, she's literally living in the building that, right? I mean, that she sort of grew up in, and you can absolutely see how that is. Okay, so how does Gemma appear? There's actually a lot of really great characters and moving pieces in it, but I assume Gemma comes first in your mind, and as you created it, what made you sort of like? So I guess what I want to know is like, do you sort of think about the plot and think, okay, obviously I need people who have real vested interest in this town, who this town really matters to. And that makes sense. A lot of those characters feel that way. But what about so what about Gemma? Like the aspects of like a marriage and, what's going on inside that when they have a, almost adult kid. And then they have these, other friends around, who have adult children. So are you building it, like, are you mapping out a world? Or are you sort of like, how does that work?
I am, when it comes to my characters, I'm much more intuitive. Like I am very much a plotter when it comes to the overall arc of the book. I like to sit down and have my outline and know what happens. But with my characters, I'm a little bit looser and just sort of, it's a little bit like, if I want birds in my garden, then I build the right birdhouse for them and see what shows up. And it's a little bit like that with me, with characters, of that I've found a situation and I've got a setting, and then I sort of sit with it for a bit and it's like, all right, well, who would live here? and what do they look like? What do they act like? How are they reacting to this situation? You know, and the character builds from there. And it was actually really challenging, the characterization of Gemma, throughout the writing and editing process, because um, I think subconsciously I understood what I was getting at before I fully consciously knew what I was trying to
Sure.
do.
Sure.
And so sometimes I would come back with things from the editor that, like, we don't understand why she's doing this. Like, maybe she should
Right.
do this instead. Like, it would make so much more sense if she did this instead. And I would have to say, yeah, you're right. It would make so much more sense. And that would be a valid solution, but it's not what I'm getting at. And they say, well, what are you
Right.
getting at? And I'm like, I don't know.
Right. It's like how, it's like you don't know the character quite well enough to understand their motivation for doing something, even if you see them do it. And I think sometimes from my experience, sometimes when I'm writing, it isn't really that I'm not a plotter. I have a sense of where the story is going, but the characters tend to make their own decisions, which I know makes it sound like I'm sort of like some sort of medium, but I do feel like when you're sitting there, the character does something and you're like, well, why are you doing that? And it's sort of, sometimes they're not emphatic about it and you can sort of shift them, but sometimes I feel like they are emphatic, and it's about figuring out why, what the motivation is for doing that, rather than saying that's not what we're doing, because the characters can be quite stubborn. And if you try to change them in a way they don't want to be changed, it can oftentimes make a mess of a book. So how many iterations so also this is your sophomore book, right? Which is, there's like this
That's right.
this whole world. I imagine you spent a lot of years writing Wake. Usually the first book you have all this time. And so tell us about that. How was the second book sort of a different process for you?
It was a really, really big shift because, like, I spent 4 years writing Wake, and that meant that I could do every iteration in my own time and, completely the way that I wanted to, and I could try a whole
Yeah.
bunch of different things. And for the bulk of the time that I was writing Wake, I really never knew if it would have an audience or not. Like, maybe this is just something special for me and I finish it for myself, and, my family reads it and tells me how great it is, and that's the end of it.
Right,
So,
right.
so it's a really different situation with the second book, where from page one, from the blank page, I knew that this would end up on shelves, and, at the very least, that some of the people who read Wake would want to read it. So with Wake, it was like, when we went to publication, the worst case scenario was that it would just disappear without a trace. Like, no one would be interested, and that would be disappointing. But what actually happened was that it really found an audience and people embraced it, which is really wonderful. And I'm not complaining, but it
Right.
also meant that with the second book,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly there were expectations, and I was like, oh, people are going to read this, and, like, what if Wake was a fluke? What if,
I know.
and so it is a little bit more nerve-wracking the second time. And at the same time, it was also a really different process because I had my editors involved and my agent. And so I was sending very early drafts to them, which I'm currently writing a third one. And I really pulled back on that this time. I was much more like, I have to be completely sure about what I'm doing before I start sending it out, because, like,
Right.
my process otherwise would be very frustrating for them, because it is sort of, I write very rough to start with, and then I
Right.
iterate and improve. And, sometimes I'll do a draft that's just focused on one character and getting them right, and we just come back to it until it's, something that I'm happy with. And so, with Wake, I had all the space in the world to do that, and to have
Right.
something that I was 100% sure, yes, this is what I want this book to be, before I ever
Yeah.
even considered showing it to anybody outside of, like, my immediate circle.
Right.
Whereas with Night of Town, it was a bit more collaborative early on, that people did get to peek at those early drafts, and, that was really vulnerable. But yeah, it's just so different.
Yeah, it is so different. And I think the imposter syndrome, which I feel like still, I'm 16 books in, still shows up with every book. I'm like, oh boy, I don't know if I can do this. But I do think that there's a really special sort of difficulty with with second book, or any book that follows a book that does really well. You know what I mean? It's like, and I think it's hard because, first of all, being a debut novelist gives you a bump, and
Mhm.
there's just a lot of buzz things that happen that for the first book that don't always happen for the second book. And it can, it can create a lot of sort of anxiety on your part, and hopefully the process now gets a little smoother and you're like, I know what I'm doing. And like you said, what you learned was it doesn't really make sense to send my agents or my agent and editors like the, beginning of the draft, because you got to figure out what you're doing, and too many cooks in the kitchen oftentimes just makes, right, a bigger mess of things. So that's exciting. And so when you did this, sounds like it's interesting that you say that you write a whole draft sort of based on one person. So you kind of know the plot, and you basically, do you mean that, for instance, you wrote this whole book, you would have written the whole book in Gemma's point of view, kind of, or how do you mean by that?
I don't, for the first two, Wake and Murder Town, like the points of view that it's written in, right from the very beginning, I knew I was going to write with those.
Okay.
With Murder Town, I did debate for a while about whether I would use the second point of view of the private investigator, Lane Holland, or whether it would just simply be Gemma.
Yeah.
Because it did create an interesting effect having 2 points of view, because they're in very different places.
Yeah.
And it's not until about 2/3 of the way through the book that they actually communicate with each other directly.
Yeah.
Which is very different from the first one, where I had 2 point of view characters that were constantly interacting. And so the story was passing back and forth.
Right.
And so I did consider for a while, very, very early on in the process, of maybe I was being a little bit self-indulgent with the second point of view. Like I was bringing back a character from the first book. Am I the only one who wants to see this character again? I can definitely say from the reception I've had here from publication in Australia that there was definitely a lot of interest in seeing that character again.
That's
so
fun.
that's a relief.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when I say that I do drafts that focus on one character, my thing that I try my very best is for every character that has a name, to understand what the book would look like if they were the main character of the book. Like, could they sustain this story as the main character? And sometimes that would completely change the genre. Like, sometimes there's massive amounts of story that only I know about that never show up in the book, because that's just their little bit that they pop up in.
Yeah.
But like in theory, you could write an entire book that is from the point of view of, Jaylene, who is grieving her murdered son and also trying to shepherd her grieving grandchild towards adulthood.
Right.
Like, she could be a point of view character.
Yes.
It could happen.
And Nico, who has a whole story of his own, right, you do a really beautiful job, because those are just sliver characters. We see them and we know them, but yeah, they have a much deeper, richer story that I think that, right, it could be a whole book. So.
Yeah, and it's immensely challenging too, that when I pick a point of view character from that point on, because I don't use omniscient, it's very much what that character sees and hears is what the reader finds out about. And so sometimes it can be really challenging to get information onto the page from her point of view. It's just all part of the process though. And sometimes those challenges of, oh God, how do I make this work? How do I get her in the room for this conversation? How do I get this tiny bit of information to her that logically she couldn't have? Sometimes the best scenes come out of trying to solve that problem as well.
Yeah, because you have to mix up where she is or what she's doing or overhears, and it sort of forces you to be more creative with it, which I think is right. I think it is, it is really interesting. And I like that. So is the third book related to this world?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a single character that appears through all three, which is Lane Holland. And so he's kind of been a bit of a supporting character in the first two, and he gets to be the main character in the third one. So it's solely from his point of view. Which
is actually lovely, because I know exactly the sort of little seed you put in that to the end of this book, which is, but I actually have to say, because I did not know that Wake is set in the same town. And I read this as a standalone, even with the little sort of like smart plan at the end where Lane could go on to do something else. I was like, oh, this is a beautiful standalone. I like that it gives us, the view of something that could happen after it, but I didn't feel like I was reading a series and I'd miss something. But now knowing that Lane is in the first book makes a lot of sense because he's gone through a lot already in this book, and I think that's lovely. I did not know that, and that's I think that is a really lovely way of doing connected stories. You know, if you want to call it a series, I don't know how. I feel like everybody names these things a little bit differently.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really cool thing that crime fiction in particular can do. That you can have a series, but for the majority of crime fiction series, you could pick up book number 8 and read it and
Yeah.
understand. And maybe you're missing a little bit of the nuance of, you know, what the characters' past relationships have been and things that have happened to them in the past. But they're always designed for that idea that you can pick this one up and you can understand this mystery. And if you loved this mystery, then you can always go back and read the first 7.
Right.
So that's a big part of what I was trying to do, that they are 2 standalone novels that share a character. And so what happens in the first book, Wake, does inform Lane's behavior in Murder Town. But if you wanted to read Murder Town first and were like, I really found that character super interesting, I'd like to know more about how he ended up in this situation, you could go back to Wake and read it like a prequel. Like, it's not
Yeah.
going to ruin either book for you, and it's not going to be difficult ever to follow what's happening in Murder Town if you haven't read Wake first.
I agree. I didn't have it. I didn't have any, I didn't have it. And I didn't even think about it, like, which I think is lovely, because sometimes you think if you know a book is a second book, or if you're reading and you think this definitely has been planted somewhere else, and it distracts from just the story that you're being told. And as we know, books come out every, year, 18 months. So sometimes even if you're into a series, it's like, oh God, do I have to reread that? Do I have to remember what it's about? And it's lovely when you can pick it up and just read through it and be like, I'm not missing, I don't feel like I'm missing anything because this isn't the first, or it's not a standalone. So that was really beautifully done. And how do you keep track of this sort of, because you do have it's a pretty good size cast. And I felt like, I wasn't like, oh God, who's that person? I have to look it up. But I did feel like there's probably, 8 or 10 characters in the book who we are sort of following. Most of them in the town, but a couple, potentially 3 in the jail, in the prison. So, what's the method for that?
Yeah, so I keep a running character list of just everybody who has a name and what their purpose is. The Murder Town, the number of characters in the town there's quite a few of them. And the most interesting thing about them is that they're all connected to each other in at least 2 different ways.
Yes,
So
they are, right.
yeah, so like, Gemma's best friend isn't just her best friend. Her best friend is also the wife of Gemma's husband's boss, and
Yeah.
their children are friends. And there's all of these
Yes.
different connections that they have to be considering all of the time. And so anytime any character in the book makes a move, it's going to affect everybody else in some way.
Yeah.
And so just trying to keep all of those plates spinning and understanding who everybody was, part of it is just that I've reread the book so many times by the time it actually gets to the point where it's finished and ready for publication, that that does make it a lot easier to keep track of these people.
Yeah.
And also is why it's really important to have the editors there to be fresh eyes and say, hey,
Yeah.
this is actually quite challenging to follow. Can we get a little bit more explanation or
Right.
a reminder of who this person is and what their relevance is? And I also do keep a character tracking list of who everybody is. I did actually sit down and attempt to map out the relationships, like a relationship web, and it
Yeah.
actually became too challenging, because
Yeah.
they're all connected so many different ways that it was immediately this spider web.
Yeah.
And I realized that the only thing I really need to understand is that spider web exists. And so just to remember that anything that's happening is affecting everybody, which, again, could be challenging at times through the writing, because then anytime a character made a move, all of the other characters would have a reaction. And so
Right.
I needed to remember wose reaction the reader would be frustrated not to see.
Right.
And
right. That's interesting
yeah,
too. And that gives sort of the idea, it's got so much authenticity to the idea of the small town, because I do think actually that is exactly, how a small town works. I mean, I have lived in a couple of sort of smaller areas, and for sure, I think, and especially when it comes to sort of people who are interrelated by job, family, marriage, blood, then it gets really, it can get really sort of heated that way. Well, I think that's smart. So can you tell us about how long it's taken to write these books? Because it does sound like, and you work as well, full time?
Um, no, I actually write full time
Oh,
now.
you do? Okay. Okay. I think
Yeah,
your
so
bio still talks about your previous job, but I'm glad you can do it, because otherwise I'm like, how are you doing this with a full-time job? So
with Murder Town, I've been able to write full time. So that's really helped a lot with the time management. I still, I have a family as well. We've got a young daughter.
yeah,
So I'm still juggling, getting her to school, getting the dog walked. We have a little bit of property with some goats and chickens, and so I have to make sure they're all fed and
right.
watered and not into something. So time management, it can be pretty challenging.
Totally.
Um, from the publication of Wake to the publication of Murder Town in Australia was 14 months. So
Wow.
that was a bit of a shock after having 4 years to work on Wake, but that's just kind of the way it goes. Like, the
Yes.
old saying, you've got your whole life to write your first book and then about a year to write the second one. And working on the third one now, I went back to them and I said, look, I think that was a really unpleasant process for everybody trying to get
Yeah.
it done in that length of time.
Right.
Like, a book a year, it's ideal for readers. Like, as a reader, I really love it when the authors I love can put out a book a year. But I
Yeah.
think about a book every other year, a book every 18 months is the speed that works for me.
Totally. And I mean, the situation, it'll all change too, right? Based on stages of life. But yeah, I did this with little kids, and yeah, it's just, and also managing a bunch of other things. It's not, and I did it with a full-time job for a while too, and that's hard too. So it's a tough thing, because you have to find some like empty space, in your brain. And if you have a million things you're responsible for, the empty space is kind of hard to come up with, right?
Yes.
I totally feel that. Well, I loved Murder Town. I definitely will look forward to reading Wake. Can you tell our listeners where to find you? I know you're on Instagram, because that's where I found you, but do you have a website and all that other good stuff?
Yes, I do. So I have my own website, which is shelleyburr.com.au. I think shelleyburr.com works as well, actually. Just spelt the same way as it appears in the episode info, I suppose.
Yeah.
Just watch that EY in my name. I am on Instagram as Shelley Burr Writes. There is a Twitter account that I was using, but I just kind of hold the name now so that nobody else grabs it and pretends to be me. So I'm not actively on that site anymore. And I also have a Facebook page, also Shelley Burr Writes, like Instagram. So
Okay.
those are
And
all the places that I'm
yeah, and
active.
like she said, Shelley is like Mary Shelley, Shelley, and Burr, Burr. So if you're just listening, you can find her. But I also think if you Google Shelley Murder Town, you'd find her as well. So
Probably.
but it'll also, of course, be linked and on the Killer Women Facebook page, and we will be giving away a copy of Murder Town here shortly. And if you're listening to this right now, then the book is out in the US. It's been out for 2 days, and you should go get your copy. I really, really enjoyed it, Shelley. Congratulations on the second book, which is, I think, the hardest of them all. I think it's a fabulous book.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Killer Women with Shelley Burr. I'm Danielle, and we'll see you next time. Bye.